Well, hello and welcome to That's a Good Question for December 5th, 2020. This is episode 27. And the question is, how can we live wisely in a foolish world? Well, as you'll notice, Pastor Larry is not here. He normally starts us out with our introduction, and he and I have a sort of dialogue in answering the question for the week. But he's not here because he is suffering from coronavirus, as is the entirety of his family. Julie and Emma and Claire and Susie, they all have contracted corona this week, and they're recovering. They're doing well. But I prevailed upon Larry to sit this one out this week so that he can just rest and recover. So he's doing that. We'll certainly miss him for this episode, but we are quite sure we'll have him back for next week's episode. So we normally have a low budget operation. This is going to be an even lower budget operation. It's just me talking into the camera via Zoom, and then we're recording it. And we're going to upload it then to our podcast area. Today, I want to provide some advice that is partial answer to that question. How do we live wisely in a foolish world? By discussing how Christians should process information. And then at the end of our time, I want to promote an upcoming preaching series that we're going to be doing in the month of January, starting in January, called From the Book of Proverbs. And it's going to be by that title, Living Wisely in a Foolish World. Now, if you've been with us for our last couple of episodes, you know that we have talked about how to handle the aftermath of the presidential election, as many seem to be distraught. Some are in denial regarding the outcome. We've tried to help those who are distraught by suggesting that the dire consequences that some have predicted, like the nation becoming socialist or Marxist, those are very, very, very unlikely, since these are in fact claims that have been made for decades and it hasn't happened yet. Now, one day it may indeed come to pass, but honestly, I don't expect it in my lifetime, perhaps not in your lifetime, but only the Lord knows. In any case, as I said in the Church Matters blog a few weeks ago, we have every reason to suppress our fears and replace those fears with trust. I mentioned in that blog that the most often given command in the Bible is do not fear or do not be afraid, fear not. And then the Bible gives reasons why you need not fear. Isaiah chapter 41, for I am with you. And it doesn't just say it'll be okay and kind of pat you on the shoulder, but gives solid reasons, God-centered reasons as to why we do not need to fear. We live in a world, a fallen world, that gives us much about which we could fear, but we need not as Christians. So if you're fearful about all of those predictions, those dire predictions coming to pass, I'm telling you, I have heard those for decades. I don't see that happening in the next 4 years. I don't see it happening in the next several years, many years. But nevertheless, even if it did happen, we need not fear as Christians. And then as for those who are in denial of the outcome of the election, we've suggested that in the face of what can appear to be overwhelming evidence that something was amiss in the election, that was stolen for Biden, we've suggested that we should take a step back and we should analyze the evidence. And more important, we should think about the nature of what we call evidence. You see, friends, what's touted as evidence in front of a microphone or in front of a camera does not usually hold up in court as proof. And that's because one can lie freely when holding a news conference, but it's much harder to do when you're under oath and you're under the threat of imprisonment in a court where the standards of proof are quite rigorous, as they should be. It's telling that as of the last count, those who have been going to court with claims of election fraud are 1 in 41. 1 in 41. 1 win, 41 losses, with judges, including Republican appointed judges, dismissing those fraud claims in very direct terms as not having any merit. The one so-called win can really hardly be called a win because it simply involved a ruling that reduced the number of days after the election in Pennsylvania that absentee votes could be counted. It reduced those number of days from 9 down to 6. It had nothing to do with fraud. And there's been no proof of widespread fraud that would have any impact on the election. And honestly, it's really becoming farcical now. With this week's hearing in Lansing, many of you may have seen snippets of that. You have Rudy Giuliani, who brought his star witness. That star witness's testimony has gone viral for reasons that you'll just have to watch to understand. So if you Google that or you YouTube that, you'll be able to find it. It's out there. And that star witness turns out to have just finished in September probation for computer crime. And that charge, for which she just finished a year of probation, was reduced from one that originally involved, these are public records, court records that you can look up online, that involved an obscenity charge. It appears that this star witness, Melissa Carone, is from the Downriver area. She was in Lansing this week next to Rudy Giuliani, testifying as his star witness. She's from the Downriver area. That's great. That's just what we need, is our name as Downriverites in Southeast Michigan associated with that. Her conviction was handed down in a court in Southgate. So friends, if she's the best you can do as your star witness, you should begin to get an idea that something is wrong here, that there are claims being made, but those claims do not constitute proof. And we've made the case that the Bible places a very high bar on claims of truth. Numbers chapter 5, Deuteronomy chapter 19, Matthew chapter 18, 1 Timothy chapter 5, many other passages in the Bible place this very high premium on making claims of truth. And in particular, when you're making claims about someone or about a group of people. If you're making a claim that someone stole, that someone lied, that someone did something that they were not supposed to do, then you're going to have proof. And the Bible demands at a very high standard of proof that you be able to produce that, or you don't make that claim against another person in the church or outside of the church. We should not make those kinds of claims. We should know that they're true, and we should be able to produce the proof that they're true if we're going to make those claims. And a person who made in the Bible false claims faced stringent penalties for doing so. We would probably be a lot better off today if, as part of our legal code, we had penalties for people who make these false claims. We do if they make them under oath, but people can say whatever they want on Facebook, on Twitter, in front of a microphone. But what does one do? What do we do with all of the so-called evidence that we have seen thrown at us over the last few weeks? You see people saying that they saw irregularities on election night, or claims that poll watchers were kept from the counting room, that there were trucks delivering votes in the middle of the night, and on it goes. Well, the hard part, friends, is not evidence, but rather proof. And that's because I alluded to this in last week's That's a Good Question. But I said that evidence is everywhere. In fact, I said it this way: everything is evidence of something. Everything. Literally every single thing that happens, no matter how small, no matter how large, it's evidence of something. So to say I have evidence really means nothing, because everything is evidence of something happening. You know, I used the example in last week's episode of you see broken glass and what was a drinking glass on your floor, and when you come home, that's evidence of something. It's evidence that a glass has broken. Now the question is, how did it break? How did that happen? And there are lots of possibilities. If you have other people living in your house, then one of them dropped it and left it there, or it was on the edge of the table and slid off because the table vibrated when a large truck went by, or something. You could have a number of explanations, but if you're going to make a claim about what that represents, it's evidence of something. That something is, yes, a glass has broken. We know that much. Now, if you want to say, I know who did it, if you want to go further and say, I want to know why they did it, well, now you're going to have proof. And so simply saying we've got evidence of things that occurred really doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything in normal life. It certainly doesn't do anything in a court of law. The hard part is not evidence. The hard part is proof. In order to make a claim that something's true, you have to prove it. And that requires putting the evidence together in a way that it's undeniable, that it's proven. To put it another way, to use legal terminology, when making a claim against a person or a group, a claim like fraud or theft of an election, then Christians don't just need to meet a preponderance of the evidence standard. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not talking to people who are lawyers, if any at all, who are. Most of us are not. But that's a standard of proof, a level of proof that's required in certain contexts in the legal profession. A preponderance of the evidence. It's a lower standard. But Christians need a beyond a reasonable doubt kind of standard in order to make claims about someone, about wrongdoing on the part of that someone. God's word does not allow us to make claims against people without the highest standard of proof, not just bits of information that we call evidence. And so you don't just say, well, that seems strange. Well, okay, it might seem strange, but what does it add up to? What does it mean? What does that thing mean, that piece of evidence? You have to show what it indicates. So, for example, a truck delivering ballots in the middle of the night. You can say that seems strange to have a truck delivering ballots. All right, maybe it is strange, maybe it's not. But that's not enough to conclude anything nefarious has gone on. Now, as a matter of fact, as it turns out, trucks delivering ballots in the middle of the night is not unusual at all in elections, and that's because most states have a central repository that ballots are delivered to from counties that are outstate, from other places, and so they come in. But the implication is that these are ballots that are coming in order to boost the totals for a candidate that was losing in the middle of the night. Well, to say that requires proof. Just saying I saw a truck with ballots is not going to do it for the high standard that Christians need to have for proof. Now, this is a claim similar to the truck coming in the middle of the night. One claim that's floated out there and that's apparently bothered many people is that on election night in Michigan and some of the other battleground states, folks went to bed and it looked like President Trump was doing very well in those states. It looked like he might well win those states. And then when they woke up in the morning, things had flipped. And the idea is that during the night, some very strange things happened. Software was used to flip votes from Trump to Biden. Truckloads of ballots were brought in and all of that. Well, there's actually a much easier explanation than all of that. None of that adds up to proof. Those are just things that trucks came in. That's true. What does it prove? That's the burden that we have before we make those claims. But there's a very easy explanation for what happened there. In this election, like all elections, but especially in this election, we had two kinds of votes. We had people voting in person, but we also had people doing mail-in votes. And we had more mail-in votes for this election, in part because we had a pandemic going on for the better part of this year. And so you had an emphasis placed upon getting your ballot in by mail so that you don't have to stand in line and risk being with people and getting the virus and all of that. And many people took advantage of that. But here's what's a couple of things interesting about it. One, most of you may know that the president chose to decry mail-ins before the election ever occurred. That mail-in is going to be fraught with all kinds of problems. Don't do mail-in voting. And so many Republicans, supporters of the president, chose not to do mail-in voting. In fact, so they chose to show up on election day and vote on election day. Democrats, on the other hand, emphasize we want our people to, if at all possible, use this so that you can be sure that your vote gets in on election day. If you get sick or something, we don't want to risk that. Let's get it in. Let's get it in early. Do your mail-in voting. Some of President Trump's handlers told him that he was making a great mistake by decrying mail-in voting, because the truth is, for many, many years, Republicans have actually been very good at getting mail-in voting in and getting applications for absentee votes and mail-in votes in the hands of their people. And so they said, we've got a great operation for that in many states, but you saying this is actually going to hurt us. So you may have noticed that the president would say this is going to be a big problem, all these mail-in votes, but then he said things like, except in Florida. In Florida, it's okay, because in Florida, they know what they're doing. Well, he ended up winning Florida, and Florida does have a big mail-in operation for Republicans. So that's one issue, was that the Democrats emphasized mail-in voting. President Trump chose to de-emphasize mail-in voting. So here's the other piece, though, with that. States each determine how they're going to count votes on up in the run-up to the election and on election day. Some states, like Florida and Ohio, their state legislatures voted to say, as mail-in votes come in, we're going to count those votes. We're not going to wait until election day to count the votes. We're going to count them as they come in, or sometime before, 7 days before. They set their own parameters on that. In Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, these are states that have Republican state legislatures. And those Republican state legislatures, because the president was downplaying mail-in votes, they were saying, don't count the mail-in votes. They were participating in the de-emphasis on mail-in. Don't count them. Now, they'll count them after the election. But that's actually what happened. So on election night, yes, it might have looked like President Trump was going to win Michigan. And then when you woke up in the morning, he's losing Michigan because these mail-in votes are finally being counted that have been sitting around, many of them for days and weeks. They're finally being counted. They could have been counted earlier, but the state legislature said, no, you can't do that. But on the other hand, it also looked early on like Biden was going to win in Ohio. And for a while, commentators were puzzled because they were sure that Trump was going to win Ohio. And he ended up winning Ohio. Trump did handily. But early on, it looked like Biden was going to win. Why? Because they counted the mail-in votes first. And those were Biden, overwhelmingly Biden votes. But then when the election day votes were counted, they were overwhelmingly for Trump. So it depended on how the state did their counting. Each state does it differently. There's no proof, none, zero, nada. They haven't been able to put it forth in court for fraud on any of that. So again, friends, just saying something seems strange, or there's a bunch of pieces of evidence, which again, evidence is a word that's pretty nebulous because it includes everything. Everything that happens is evidence of something. So just saying there's a bunch of evidence out there, there must be something wrong, is not good enough for Christians. Here's an example. Some of you may know the name Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas is a guy, very smart guy, Christian guy. He's written some books, I'm told, that have been helpful. I have heard him speak a few times. He makes a very impressive presentation. Something about him, I think it was my sense that he was a very ambitious guy. And I am not big on ambitious Christians who want to make a name for themselves. Now, I have to be careful because I don't know that, but and therefore I don't want to violate my own standard. I'm not accusing him of that because I don't know that, but I simply just withheld endorsing, buying his stuff, following him. So I've never, I think using his name right here is the first time I've ever used it publicly. But he's a Christian, and I've heard many other people who have benefited from his books. But he's losing credibility by the day as a result of this election. He's assuring people that God is going to miraculously overturn the results of the election, saying things like, people say, I'm quoting now, oh, you don't have enough evidence. We have enough evidence in our hearts. That's a quote. Oh, you don't have enough evidence. And he says, we have enough evidence in our hearts that Trump won this election. He compares it to our believing in Jesus. That people say you don't have enough evidence, but we say we have enough evidence in our hearts to believe in Jesus. And in the same way, we have enough evidence in our hearts that Trump won this election. He goes on to say, I'd be happy to die in this fight. He told that to the president himself earlier this week during a call with the president that was broadcast on Metaxas radio show. He says, this is a fight for everything. God is with us. So a lot of over-the-top claims, a lot of claims about fraud, a lot of evidence, but not a lot of proof. In fact, not a lot of proof, no proof. So what do Christians do in the face of an onslaught of information in what is called the information age? When, as we've said the last couple of weeks, voices from media are amplified and they are monetized. They're amplified because they're able to come at you 24/7 and you have easy access to it. You can plug into the internet. You can listen to my voice like you're doing right now. So even no-name people like me can have a voice that gets amplified in ways that it couldn't in the past. People who aren't members of the church that I pastor, if they so choose, can listen to what I'm saying. And you do that with people who market themselves, and you do that with shows and podcasts that really want to amass a large audience. And so these voices are amplified 24/7 through the internet, on cable, still on the radio, and they are monetized. They're businesses. One reason that these voices desire to be amplified is because the more people who listen, the more they can monetize it, the more they can have advertisers, the more they can make money. It's a business for many. So what do we do then, especially as Christians in the midst of all of that coming at us? Well, first let me say what we do not do. What we do not do. We do not drop out. We do not disengage. As Christians, we are to engage, and we're to show how Christ and how biblical truth relate to what's happening in our day. I've made the point in the last few weeks that your New Testament, many of the letters in your New Testament are what scholars call occasional documents. That means that they were written to address a particular occasion, things that were happening. In particular, things that were happening in the church, but those things that were occurring, the occasions that were going on in the church that prompted an apostle Paul or Peter or James to write these occasional documents. They're written to address what's happening in the church, but that what's happening in the church is often related to what's happening in society. So you take the book of 1 Corinthians. This is a book written to address a number of issues that were going on in the day. Well, some of those issues that were going on in the day in Corinth are related to things that were happening at large in the city of Corinth that are being brought into the church in Corinth, affecting Christians who were part of that church in Corinth. And so we don't just disengage. It's not just, you know what, pastor's right. There's just so much false information that's being peddled out there as proof that's not really proof. I'm just going to unplug and I'm going to read my Bible. Now, listen, rather than listen to false stuff and be scared by it and unduly influenced by it, I'd rather you unplug and read your Bible. But we don't just drop out and unplug. That's not the right answer, friends. And secondly, here's another non-answer. It's not the right answer. It's to censor. And so we don't drop out, and we also don't support censoring. Now, censorship in our day, from what I can tell, is mostly coming from the left, from the liberal side of the political spectrum. But in reaction, conservatives, most of those listening to me right now fit into that category, need to be very careful. Twitter and Facebook are putting up warnings about speech that they believe is not true, is not accurate. They've been doing that with regard to the president and many of the things he says. And so they put a warning out there. As I understand it, they don't keep it from being posted. I don't believe. I think it's posted, but then they put a warning that says this is disputed, or it's not completely accurate, or something to that effect. But then you can click to actually view what was said. So it's not completely eliminated, but there's a warning put on it. Just this week, there are hearings in the United States Senate run by Republicans who are upset about that, and understandably. And they're looking to change laws to prohibit Twitter and Facebook from doing that kind of thing. Now, I'm not here to tell you the right policy on that. I don't know. I can simply say this. Knowing something about history and how censorship has affected people on the right, conservatives, I would just say you would want to be very careful about that, because the cure can be, if you're not careful, worse than the disease. And conservatives of all people have history that should teach them that since they were victims of government action with regard to speech in the past, they ought to be very, very careful. Let me run through somewhat quickly, I hope, some of that history. Back in the 40s and 50s, people got most of their information through two major sources. They got it through newspapers, they got it through radio. Television had not gotten been invented only for a short time and had not been distributed to average American homes like it would be in the 50s and 60s. Most of those radio stations were owned by large networks. So NBC, CBS, they had network affiliates for these radio stations. But then in the 50s and 60s, as television became wildly popular and the price of televisions went down enough for the average household to own a television, then people started getting their information through television, their news through television. And as a result of that, now the big money networks that had these radio stations in local markets around the country, they started to divest from those, started to sell those off. Independent, smaller owners started to buy radio stations around the country. And who got on those stations? Who were now the voices on those local stations? Many of them were conservative commentators, including very conservative preachers. Billy James Hargis was a guy out of Arkansas, and he owned hundreds of stations, or I take that back, he was on hundreds of stations around the country. And he wasn't just preaching the gospel, he was preaching a political message, an anti-communist message. A man some of you may know this, named Carl McIntyre. He was a Presbyterian minister. He was a fundamentalist, Bible-believing, out of Collingwood, New Jersey. He had a church there, but he also got into radio, and he was a vehement anti-communist as well. And so he not only preached the gospel, but he also preached Americanism, and he preached anti-communism. And one of the things that happened was, with all this proliferation of these right-wing voices on these radio stations around the country, they were starting to have impact on people during the Kennedy administration of the 60s. And the Kennedy administration took notice at how much effect and influence these conservative preachers and commentators were having. Here's one example of the kind of effect that these radio preachers and commentators were having. They were denouncing communism to the extent that they said we, the United States, should not have any imports coming in from communist countries. And well, that included Poland as a country that was influenced by communism and the Soviet Union at the time. And so, and I'm not making this up, there was a boycott of Polish hams. And this boycott of Polish hams was amazingly successful. And it was successful being carried out by guys like Carl McIntyre and Billy James Hargis and others on the radio. and they would tell people, don't buy Polish hams. Go to your local grocer and tell the grocer, if you stock Polish hams, we're not going to shop here anymore. But no, don't leave it at that. Go further. Housewives, and there were many, many housewives in the 50s. Most women did not work outside the home. They stayed in the home, raised the kids. This is when Tupperware parties and Avon and all of that, those kinds of parties in homes, we still have those, as we know, but they really became very popular at that time, as housewives would host those. It was a way to socialize, but also do business. Well, using that concept, they had card parties, and these women would get together and they would make these cards, and they would mass produce these cards, and then they would go out to grocery stores and they would put these cards on the shelves, and they would say something like, "Be aware that this store buys products from communist countries." Well, that was enough to scare people. It was in the middle of the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. And as I say, it was wildly successful. Some of you may be old enough like me to remember EJ Corvette. We used to have Corvette stores here in our area in Southeast Michigan, but they were in Philadelphia and other places. And the Corvette, as corporate, got wind of this, and they took these things off their shelves. The products that were coming, not just Polish hams. I don't even know if Corvette sold hams, but it was a department store, but other things that they would take off their shelves because they didn't want to be accused of being soft on communism. And that was what was happening to President Kennedy. He was being accused of being soft on communism. So what the Kennedy administration did in reaction to that was they dusted off something called the Fairness Doctrine. That was enforced by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and it ended up, now get this, it ended up putting conservatives off of the radio for nearly 2 decades. Let me just, as briefly as I can, explain how that happened. But some of you might know the name Walter Ruther. He was the president of the UAW in the 60s. He and his brother, Victor, wrote something called the Ruther Memo to the Kennedys, to John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, with their suggestions on how to silence these right-wing voices on the radio. And one of the things that they suggested in that memo, it's a memo, you can look up the Ruther Memo, R-E-U-T-H-E-R, Ruther Memo. You can look that up and read what they said. But one of the things they said was, we need to use this thing that's been in the FCC's regulations for a while, called the Fairness Doctrine, but it really hasn't been utilized. And we think it can be utilized in a way that will silence these voices. So here's what they did. The Fairness Doctrine, the idea was this, at least in the way the FCC implemented it, was that if someone on the radio said something negative about someone else or another group, that someone else or that group could complain, or others could complain to the radio station on their behalf. If a radio station license holder, and the FCC gave these licenses, if the license holder received complaints about a particular statement made by anybody, but most of the people on these radio stations were right-wing people, then the people about whom it was said were to be given airtime to refute what was said. Now, when I say they were to be given airtime, I mean literally gifted airtime, because the FCC regulations and the Fairness Doctrine said that you need to give them time to refute what was said about them, and if they say they can't pay for it, then you need to be able to you have to make it available for free. Well, lo and behold, miraculously, no one who ever complained about what was said about them could pay for it. They all said, no, we can't pay for it. And just making the claim that this was said about us and we can't pay for it forced these license holder radio stations to give free airtime. It put these radio stations, many of them across the country, out of business. But before they went out of business, the first thing they did was they had to get these right-wing people off the radio because it was costing them. Every time one of these anti-communists said that the Kennedy administration or the Democratic National Committee or whatever, or the UAW, they're all in cahoots together and they're all a bunch of communists and they're all going to turn us over to the communists. If they said something negative like that, then the radio station had to give free airtime to an opposing voice. So those preachers, they went from hundreds down to just dozens. They became minuscule in terms of the number of radio stations where they were aired over a period of just a few years. And this was deliberately done by the Kennedy administration. They used the Fairness Doctrine, they used the IRS to go after the tax exemption of some of these right-wing preachers and commentators. And so that went on up until the late 70s, when, of all people, Jimmy Carter, Democrat President Jimmy Carter, who deregulated industries like no other president we've ever had. I know that sounds weird because our liberal friends are mostly associated with more government and more regulation. Jimmy Carter actually deregulated industries more than anybody, more than Reagan, more than anybody, including the airline industry. The reason that we can fly today as cheaply as we can is because of deregulation of the airline industry that started in the 70s with Jimmy Carter, and that included the communications industry. It was in the 80s under Reagan that finally that the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated completely. As a result of that, what we know as right-wing radio now, that is just ubiquitous all over the airwaves. That's why it's so ubiquitous. There would have been no Rush Limbaugh. There would have been none of the other right-wing voices that have been on for decades had it not been for the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine. You could read about this. There's a book that I recommend. It's called Radio Right, and the author is Paul Matzko, Matzko, and he writes all about this. I give you all that to just say, listen, censorship goes both ways. And it's not the answer. So the answer is not to disengage, it's not to censor, and it's not to silo. It's not, friends, to get in your own silo and just listen to one side all of the time. And that's what, unfortunately, many of us are doing. We've got one voice that is yelling at us on the radio all the time, or multiple voices yelling the same thing. Same thing with our news stations on television, same thing with the websites that we go to, and they're all telling us the same kind of thing. And so we are in our own silo. The answer is that we should be able to listen to multiple voices, but discern those voices, choose. That's what discern requires. It means to distinguish, to separate out. That's what the word means. And it means to separate that which is true, that which is fruitful, that which is edifying from that which is not. And discernment, friends, is an aspect of wisdom. In the information age, it's no longer the case that, as we used to say, information is power. That used to be true because information was hard to get. But now everybody has information. The problem is we're overwhelmed with information and we don't know how to process it. We don't know what to do with it. Wisdom and discernment is an aspect of wisdom. Wisdom is what you do with the information. It's applied knowledge. Discerning wisdom requires a disciplined mind that reasons properly to valid conclusions. And that includes, and I'll be finishing up here in just a bit, avoiding things like logical fallacies as we listen to things and we say things. I mean, I'll talk about some of those logical fallacies here in a minute, but we don't just take information and then, because it came from a voice that we trust, we just put it out. That's one of the things some of you are doing and have been doing. You just forward it. You just put it out there. You just parrot it. No, a discerning mind, a wise mind thinks about it, processes it. And in doing that, it comes to valid conclusions because it avoids things like logical fallacies, things like what's called the genetic fallacy. That is, the genesis of an idea determines whether or not it's true. That's not the case. And so if an article is in the New York Times, it might be true, despite being in the New York Times. or in the Washington Post. But you hear people, you read people say, well, that came from the New York Times. It can't be true. Well, that's nonsense. You have to evaluate whether or not it is true on its own terms. Ad hominem attacks are simply attacking the person, attacking the source, rather than looking at the substance of what is said. There's a fallacy called the Post-Hoc Fallacy that says, because it happened after that, it must have happened because of that. And so it's making a cause and effect relationship. Some of you have heard that correlation is not causation. That's true. And so we need to just stop and think about, does this necessarily result in that? And if we're going to be wise people, discerning people, friends, we got to be humble people. We have the humility to say, you know what, I might be wrong. And I'm willing to admit that. And so I don't just hit the button and forward it out there. And then if it turns out to be wrong, oh, well, and then I'll move on to the next thing. Wisdom is never having to delete your tweet. Okay. Wisdom means I can put it out there with confidence because I know it's true, because I've vetted it. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be of particular intelligence. It's not about being insightful. This is simply about being disciplined in the way we use our minds. I'm going to be writing about that on my blog this week, and also talking about it when we get into this series on the book of Proverbs. And so I want to end with that. In January, we're going to start a series in the book of Proverbs. And when I choose series for our church to preach through, I don't choose them based upon just, I would like to personally learn from more about that book. Certainly I do want to do that, and that's one of the outcomes of preaching through a book. I learned plenty out of it, but I choose the particular book I'm going to go through based upon where I think our congregation is. I'm choosing to go through the book of Proverbs because of the time that we live in now and the onslaught of information with which we're being bombarded, so that we can learn to use our minds properly, use biblical wisdom to process that which with which we're confronted, and so that we can then process it and then disseminate truth to people, truth that informs, but truth that uplifts as well. So thank you for listening to this low budget time for me to just speak to you on these, what I think are important topics. I'll see some of you in person this coming Sunday. Many more of you are going to see me via live stream this coming Sunday. Either way, it's Lord willing, we'll be together. Thanks for watching.
If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.